when you have thinkers that think profoundly about goodness, what you find actually is that even cross-culturally, you'll have these thinkers, whether they call them philosophers or sometimes theologians, they will come to, or politicians even, by that I mean a political figure or a statesman, not uh, a politician running for office in democracy. That's a very different thing. Okay, those people are almost universally incapable of profound thought. But if we're thinking about people who are deeper thinkers, okay, who exercise some kind of sense of authority and leadership for the community, all right, um, then what we find is that you have among these high-level thinkers a certain interesting conclusion that almost gets formulated almost the exact same way, okay? Which is these four ideals: goodness, rightness, beauty. Okay, so goodness, rightness, beauty, and truth. All right, that these four things tend to overlap highly with each other. All right. So if you look at, for example, the the first prime minister of the Joseon dynasty, Jung Do-jeon. Okay. If you look at um, Martin Luther of the Reformation, um, if you look at those two people, right, you see this formulation of these four things together. Okay. Of course, once you translate them into the same language. But if you also look at philosophers, okay, they might not make this exact list of four things, but you can tell by the way they talk about things that, they consider truth to be beautiful, right? Or they consider that they might make the argument that something it can only truly be beautiful if it accords with what is right. Okay. So I want to talk about this connection between two specific things, beauty and morality. Okay. That, it's not just simply something like, okay, you have this really elegant mathematical proof and that itself is beautiful, right? You could talk about the intersection between beauty and truth that way, but I'm trying to talk about morality and beauty, okay, such that something that is immoral or unrighteousness actually lacks beauty or has an ugliness. Okay, so do you see the difference between lacking beauty and having ugliness? One is actually constructive, the other is a lack of something good, right? Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give my case for it, and then why don't you try to give me a counter example, and I'll explain why actually that counter example is still accounted for and what I'm about, what I my framework that I'm establishing. Okay. All right. So beauty and morality. Let's start with some examples of how that would work. Right. If we're thinking about Li, which is translated as it's a term that doesn't really translate well into one or two words, right? So one that's common is ritual propriety, but that doesn't really capture it because what we want to do is we want to list a number of words that pertain to Li. Okay, so that would be um, something as so-called small or everyday as manners, etiquette, consideration, dignity, uh, up to propriety, um, ritual, ritual propriety, ceremony or ceremonialness, and decorum. Okay, so this is a basically a range of behavior that is considered dignified, proper, correct. Okay, now that doesn't mean you're completely rigid here. You have some flexibility in this. Okay, so what might be truly Li for one situation might be a little bit different for another situation. Now there are the rights, right? For example, you get married, you're not really adjusting that too much, if at all. Okay, but in terms of everyday behavior, like how you discuss finances, maybe with your father, okay, like you're in college and you're like, okay, I think I need to spend more money, right? How you discuss that is going to be guided through Li, and that's where it has more of a, you know, a connotation of things like manners and etiquette. Okay. All right. So that's there, but it wouldn't really make sense to talk about um, that sort of thing without a sense of righteousness, right? If you are using, etiquette and stuff to manipulate somebody into thinking you're a better person, there's something perverse about that, right? It actually ends up becoming ugly, right? There's an ugliness to that. Even if it's not on the surface, there's something that's uglier about somebody who pretends to be your friend using etiquette, using Lee, but actually is setting you up to get ripped off, right? Setting you up to be betrayed. Okay. Let's look at music, right? So a lot of people, particularly Americans, I suppose, it's a morally neutral experience, right? You listen to this music, no matter how much this person yells or screams or has this kind of really off harmonic, disharmonic um, melody, no matter how much of that is there, no matter how much it booms, right? No matter how much it displaces your heart rate, people think it's just morally neutral. Okay, even to the point where they're actually talking about um, some really perverse things, like just blatant lust, right, or blatant greed. Okay, they will actually insist that there's a moral neutrality to this. Okay, um, but there really isn't. Okay, and the reason why there isn't, it's not bereft of morality, right? Or sorry, let me put it this way, of a moral dimension, even beyond lyrics, is because they're and I don't know if I could even say there's like a causation that I could give. It's more of let me put it this way. You have to first identify the correlation here. Okay. You have to identify the correlation. And this is kind of getting back to what we had talked about another time, which is that we're kind of um, we're somewhat retarded, right? We're made to be retarded, right? In other words, slow to understand, right? Um, to understand the worth of content, right? So we're always thinking about form. We can identify form, right? And that connects to our understanding of rights. Like I have the right to free speech, right? That's kind of a form, okay? Like we're not looking at the content, right? What am I using your speech to say, right? We're just looking at the form of it, right? The category of it, right? And then so we're comfortable with that, but we're not comfortable with judging content, right? Because when we have to judge content, we now have to actually act somewhat intuitively. Okay, we have to actually act intuitively. But when we start to act intuitively because of our, modern sensibilities, our democratical sensibilities, we think everything is about the individual taste or, equality. Okay, but it's actually not the case, right? So if you look at what makes music beautiful, there's an order to it, there's an expression to it. Okay, um, it connects with your feelings and produces a feeling of rightness. Okay, either love, which is itself right and moral. Okay, or you could feel sorrow as something that was good but you lost or you don't have or you're away from, like you miss your husband. It could also connect to something else like um, even something like the ability to harness and to focus your energy towards something good, right? To something worthwhile, right? So even a march, right? Shunja says that the ancient kings, they would adorn their righteous anger, okay, not anger for some sake, but because they're, anger against an injustice or something that is wicked, right? They would adorn that with music, right? And that you could think of as, marches, right? So these things actually do orient and order your spirit towards something that is morally good, okay? And so that is beauty, okay? That it inspires you to want to be good, to be morally right, Okay. It inspires you towards that direction. That's good music. That's beautiful music, whatever it is, right? Whether it's happy, sorrowful, joyful, you know, um, intense, okay, whatever that is. Now, if you look at ugly music or immoral music, right, it's the opposite. Okay, the lyrics already indicate it, but even without the lyrics, if you look at that beat, okay, that beat, it engenders disorder within your soul. It makes you want to lash out. It doesn't focus you, it makes you want to lash out. Okay, it makes you lustful rather than loving. Okay, it makes you um it makes you angry, okay, but not because something has been something is immoral, okay, or maybe I should say it this way, right? Um, there are some songs out there that make you feel pity for yourself, okay? That's not that tends to be ugly music. Okay. But because what we're talking about with righteous anger is that this is something that aspires you still towards a moral standard, right? You're willing to fight to achieve a high moral standard, not because you just feel like somebody has slapped you in the face. Okay. That's not really what the music should be doing. So I wanted to make that distinction there. Okay. Because there's a lot of rap out there that makes you feel, that makes you feel self-pity, essentially, right? So if you look at music, what is good music, it does inspire you towards what is good, what is righteous. Okay, that's what actually is beautiful about it and why it could be called beautiful. All right, so having said that, do you have any counter examples that you think you might have or other people might say that would be, a way to say, well, it's all just neutral anyway, or, how could you say this is bad music and, why is this bad music and so forth?
I can't really think of any examples of counter arguments. I think deep down people know that it's bad. They just try to deny it because they don't want to make themselves look bad, but then they make themselves look worse by denying the truth even more.
Yeah, I think you could go all the way back to where it starts to become very ambiguous, right? Because I think with something like hip hop, rap and stuff, right? Especially what you could call like, I don't know, ghetto rap or something, or I don't know what they call it now. They're always changing the names, right? And so this is something where we get to the another variable, another one of these four, which is truth, right? They are distorting truth because they're using words that are not actually accurate, precise, or appropriate to what they are um, trying to mean, right? So you can always keep changing this term, right? Rap or hip hop or ghetto or whatever, right? It's just you keep changing the term because there's no fixed meaning because what you're trying to do is just give this general feeling, but the feeling itself is negative, right? It's not abstracted like purely instrumental music, right? It's the feeling itself is negative, and then you have these lyrics, and the lyrics are not really about something. They're just kind of getting you to a certain kind of mood by just saying these words in quick succession, okay, or through repetition, right? If you keep saying the word love again and again, um, but it doesn't really make any sense, right? Then what you're really doing is draining that with every time you repeat it, you're draining that of emotional meaning. Okay, and that itself is ugly, right? Um, so think about a steak that's been overcooked, right? It's kind of drained of flavor, right? If you think of, I don't know, boiling a steak, that's terrible, right? Because you're draining it of flavor, right? And so something like that is like that. Okay. It's just mass produced and it's constantly new. It's constantly novel. It's constantly changing it up so that it seems novel and you get this kind of dopamine spike from it. But ultimately, it's not about anything that you can cherish as a classic. Okay. But let's go back to jazz, right? Let's go all the way to jazz because I think this is where things start to depart. And what I'm, I'm not going to pretend to know every little bit of jazz. So if what I say does not apply to your little niche of jazz at a certain point in American history by a certain musician, then feel free to reject this. But um, if you look at a lot of this kind of music that is supposedly impromptu and that kind of thing, um, there's a lack of order to it. There's a lack of order to it, uh, and um, if you look at this sort of music, um, it is expressive, but it's also still literally disordered. Okay. Um, it's also something that is more background. Okay. Not to say that you couldn't play these things in the background, but actually good music should actually be something that not only draws your attention, but is something that could be fully enjoyed by paying attention to it. Okay. And one of the things that you could do is you could always connect this to other dimensions of aesthetic experience. Okay. So for example, physical beauty, okay, like a beautiful painting, okay, or even the human body, right? You can or you can compare it to a fine meal, right? So there are certain foods like chips, popcorn. It's not that healthy for you, and you usually watch something, right? It's kind of there, but at best you're distracted from the enjoyment of it, right? You're just kind of putting it into your mouth, right? But something with true beauty, you want to enjoy it in quiet and without disruption, right? So if you are going to go to a fine dining, right? Which is something that's been closing down more and more these days, okay? Because people do not appreciate it. But if you're thinking about fine dining, right? Is it just pompousness why you have a waiter that is quiet, right? You have a certain ambiance, you have a certain dress that you can't bring your dogs in, right? That is supposed to be quiet. Okay. Is it just pompousness and elitism? No, it's because it actually allows you to focus on the meal. Okay. So it's quiet and you are there, and now you can appreciate all the subtle flavors, all the balance, all the nutrition, all the delicacy, right? You can experience that and treasure it. Okay. Because you have that opportunity, right? You're focusing on it. You're present. Okay. And it goes the same for visual experiences, right? Should the museum actually be quiet? Because what you're looking at, whether it's a sculpture, it's a painting, right? It should, you should actually focus your attention on it. You should be present. You should be immersed in it, right? That way you could actually move your soul. So music should actually be the same. It should not be in the background to a party, okay? It should be something that you sit and then absorb yourself into, or when you play, you're absorbed into that, right? When you're performing or you're playing, your whole soul is absorbed into that, okay? But if it's something they could just put in the background, right? This is not really beautiful music, okay? If it's going back to ritual, right, or ceremony, if you're half paying attention to it, you're not really there. You're not really doing it, right? You have to be fully present, right? Okay. So that's something that really is a great indication that something is actually ugly or lacking in beauty, right? I mean, if I'm eating a bunch of potato chips or a bowl of popcorn, I'm watching something, right? It's just something that's just kind of additional there, you know, and it's not particularly delicious, right? It's not something I could ever describe as delicious, okay? It's not something that I can, you know, say this was an experience and so forth, right? So this kind of music, right? it should be there for you to actually sit down and listen to, and then it it puts your soul, it orients your soul towards what is right and good, and it starts to even order that so that you do prioritize, so that you are reminded of what's really important, what's truly good, what's truly right, what's truly um I suppose you could say truly true, right? But although that's a bit of a redundancy, but what is, I guess you could say truly true. Another way to say that is what is precise, right? To have more precise understanding, right? And so good music, good poetry, that should allow you to do that. Okay. Um, so I think what's kind of tricky is that because of the way that the human brain works, you can start to get addicted. Uh, you could start to, through a kind of Pavlovian neuropsychological response, um, you could start to, quote unquote, enjoy something that is actually disgusting. Okay. That can actually happen, right? Um, so I think this is particularly observable when you're thinking about um, uh, actually how fetishes are formed. Okay, because you have this sort of experience and that's tied with something that is neurologically very intense, very pleasurable. Okay, but it's associated psychologically with something that is actually disgusting. And then through the repeated association, you actually will be neurologically aroused from that disgusting stimulus, objectively disgusting stimulus, okay, into something that is actually natural. Okay. And then so through that connection, you even have people start to identify with that. All right. Even though it's completely dysfunctional, unhealthy, or even disgusting. Okay, you will have people end up doing that. And then that becomes its own sort of problem, right? So I think this is where the actual confusion lies, right? Like if you actually look at this objectively, you can actually tell that there is a deep connection between beauty and morality. Okay. However, if you are raised in a dysfunctional, disordered, chaotic, or oppressive, or exploitative, or simply a perverse environment, right? Then you could actually end up enjoying the taste of freeze burn, right? The kind of flavor that you have when you have something frozen for a long time, right? Because if that's all the food you eat, right? I've heard of stories where, somebody grows up really poor and that's the only food that they eat is freezer burned tasting food. They actually start to think that's how food should taste and they actually find it tasty, right? But that's not natural, right? And at least in that case, it's just kind of you're lacking some nutrition, right? Because the longer it's frozen, the less nutritious it is, right? But it's pitiable. Okay, it's pitiable to be somebody who finds that to be tasty. It's pitiable to be somebody who finds that to be attractive, right? So I think that's the kind of thing. Like if you associate good times with this hip hop, right? Because people seem to be having fun, right? Or because this is so loud and it's such a rush of words that your dopamine spikes, you actually start to think you enjoy it. And that's the sad thing because objectively it is ugly. All right. It is actually objectively ugly and there's nothing really good or right about it, but you can do that, you know? Um, that is something that can certainly happen. And I think that's really a dysfunction or a sort of maybe I could say a bug or a glitch in the brain that you can actually be start to associate what is disgusting with what is pleasurable, right? But that's different from beauty, okay? Because beauty actually is objective. All right, so now I've been talking for a while. It, I don't know. What do you think that makes sense? Should I explain a bit more, or uh, do you think there are some kind of gaps in what I'm saying here, or do you want to ask any questions or have me analyze any particular things in life regarding beauty and morality?
I think it makes sense with what you explained. Um, you can even maybe think of more examples of how people get confused with what is true beauty versus, let's say, something that is like lustful, for example. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that or due to their experiences, stuff
I
like
think a
that.
lot of the times, in addition to what I was saying, is that they actually haven't experienced beauty, you know? Like, if all you've, if all you've been having is like McDonald's level restaurant food, you don't really understand what kind of, what's out there, right? You just don't understand because that's all the range of experience. Okay. I knew this, much older man. He was dean of a high school, and in order to illustrate a point, he basically asked this high school young man to do a bunch of push-ups or pull-ups or something, and if he could meet that number, he would take him to any restaurant he wanted. Okay, and then he said after finishing this task or this challenge, he asked for McDonald's. And he said, no, okay, I'm not taking you to McDonald's. I'm going to take you to this restaurant. Okay. So he took him there. Okay. And then the whole point is he wanted to show him that this is actually out there. Okay. And so I think like a lot of people, they just were not raised, well, not by their parents, but by the culture, which is really to say the government, right? Did not raise the people well. Okay. So one of the things that, to note is that America is actually pretty ugly. Okay. Because if you think about where, um, if you ask the question, okay, let me ask you this question. Um, where is America beautiful?
At most, some geographical locations.
The parks, right? Is that what
Yeah.
you're thinking? Yeah.
Mhm.
In other words, America is beautiful where America is not, right? If you really think about it, America is beautiful where America is not. Do you understand what I'm saying here, right? Where
Yeah.
American
Yeah.
society is not, or American building structures are not, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
America's actually, I know there's certain like, you know, uh, the countryside is always going to have some kind of charm, right? No matter where you are. And if you go to the really old colonial areas, right, there is some degree of beauty there, right, to the extent that it might be preserved or something, right? And it was in the first place built to be beautiful, right, and not just practical. But the closer you get to, say, California, right, the more modern you get, the uglier it becomes. Okay. So a lot of it is just you haven't experienced beauty. And so you actually don't know what you're missing out on. Okay. Like, have you gotten some of these people to actually sit down and listen to classical music and play classical music, right? And express themselves through these actual instruments and not just belt out words really quickly? Have you actually gotten them to do that? Because I assure you, the kinds of people who have that capability, okay, they have a better aesthetic sense, have a better sense of beauty, okay? And even if you do find some people who make that kind of garbage music, deep down inside they know it's garbage music and they're just doing that to make money, okay? Because they know it'll sell, it's easy to mass produce, it's easy to promote. They'll they'll be like that, they'll make music like that, I think. Um, because it is profitable, you know. Uh, so that's the thing, and this is something else, is that a disordered mind is attracted to disordered things, right? So if you have these people that are living very disordered lives, it is easier for them to be pulled towards something that is disorderly, right? If you're living a disordered life, are you going to be able to make a fine meal at home? Or are you just going to go grab something that you can microwave in yeah, if you can just microwave, right? If you are, um, if you live a disordered life, right? Are you going to write some beautiful poetry? No, right? If you live a disordered life, are you going to, uh, seek out, if you're going to be, are you going to be able to sit there and listen to classical music and really focus on what's being played and be immersed in all the nuances and all the variations that are taking place within that music? No, you can't do that. You're gonna, what's gonna get through your disordered mind is somebody literally screaming at you, right? What's gonna get through your disordered mind, right, when you're eating is something that has a ton of salt, a ton of fat, a ton of butter, right? Or a ton of sugar, right? Something that really just screams at you. Okay. If you're going to, you know, if you're going to be kind of disordered, right, you're really anxious and everything, then what's the kind of shows, narratives, fictional narratives you're gonna watch? Something that really requires you to focus and to kind of think broadly about things, or are you just gonna go watch some explosions on the screen, right? So the more disordered your own life is, the more disordered your own mind is going to be, the more disordered your own mind is going to be, the more it's going to be attracted to disordered stimulations. Because your mind is not really capable of immersing itself into something of true beauty, sublime order, something that inspires you towards rightness, because you're low energy and your mind is disordered and your heart is anxious. So does that does that seem to make sense here?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I do want to address something, the something like eloquence, okay, that can be mistaken for something that is beautiful. But remember, there's these four items, right? Beauty, goodness, rightness or morality, and truth. And so something can sound sophisticated, and if you actually look at the root word of that, sophistry, right, you'll know that something that's sophisticated is almost basically anti-truth. Okay. But if you find somebody who is very eloquent, is he saying these things at the expense of truth? If he says things in a very charming or charismatic way, is he doing these things at the expense of goodness or rightness? Okay. So what you'll find is that actually it's very tacky. It's actually not just imprecise, it's not only incorrect, it's not only wrong, but it's actually tacky. It's improper or just something greasy about it, right? Look at some of these adjectives. Instead of saying flattery, we might use the word greasy, right? Instead of saying something is bad, we might call it foul. Okay. I don't think these words exist by accident because I think the mind and heart is connecting, right? Something that is distasteful, right? Um, something that is, you know, something that goes against our aesthetic sense and associating that with falsehood, with something that's wrong morally or factually. So there are a lot of speakers out there. They sound very intelligent. Some of them might be charismatic, some of them might not. Some of them, they sound like they know what they're talking about. They're very confident. They could really dress it up in all this language. It doesn't mean that they are true or correct. It doesn't mean what they're saying is actually right or good. So this is why you started with these four words, is because these should all come towards virtue, right? What is true, what is good, what is right, what is beautiful. All those converge towards a single point. And as they converge, something that you thought was attractive before, you recognize is not really beautiful because it does not, or is simply against the other three: goodness, truth, rightness. So you start to actually see it as ugly. because their senses have actually been refined. They are purified. Okay. And with that pureness, this is how one can really become a sage, a person who is a ideal human being in every dimension. Okay. And every dimension that is about the spirit, that's spiritual, that is about virtue, right? Your um, how virtuous you are, right? That's all coming together, you know. And um, to a lot of people, that's kind of empty words, unfortunately, because we haven't really, in order to understand words, you have to actually understand the concept, right? So don't, um, if you don't have the concept, you can't really understand the word, and if you don't have a word, you can't really identify the concept, right? So that's why, language is actually really important for our cognition as human beings. And that's why when you look at animals, their lack of linguistic ability really hampers their ability to do things on principle, right? They really go hand in hand. They really help each other there. Okay. But this is not we'll talk about evolution another day, but I don't think that this kind of level of metacognition, you can call it, maybe that's a good term for it. I haven't really thought it through, but this kind of level of cognition is not actually something that's helpful for survival. I mean, you can fashion tools without having this sort of level of cognition. But in any case, our ability to have a sense of beauty and rightness, okay, not just understand truth, okay, but to have a sense of beauty and rightness, um, that's essentially human, right? In other words, you don't find that in other animals, right? Other animals could be compassionate, right? They could have a sort of a loyalty or a bond, okay? Animals can certainly bond, but they can't do things simply because they believe it's right, okay? They also like a sense of beauty, right? Like, um, that's why they just defecate anywhere, right? Or right in front of you, because you don't have a sense of that, right? They don't know how to honor others. They know how to submit, but they know how to have a sense of fear, but they don't know how to honor someone, right? I mean, when your parents get old, you will be physically stronger than them. You'll be typically financially, right? Um, more robust than them, right? They're very frail and weak compared to you, but you learn to honor them typically, right? If you're healthy and you have a healthy relationship, especially, you typically learn to honor them more, right? Even though they are much frailer than they've ever been, and you're much stronger than they've ever been in every measurable sense, right? But you still honor them. Why? Because we're human beings. Okay, we have that capacity. And so somebody who uh, lacks or disregards their capacities or faculties for goodness and righteousness and truth and beauty, those are literally lesser human beings. Okay, they are worse human beings. And those who have a strong sense of these, they are better human beings, right? Because if you have a stronger sense of it, then naturally you will want to abide by it. Okay, doesn't make you perfect, but it makes you a much better person, and it gives you the ability to become an even greater person, an even more virtuous person. Okay, and so that's why I know I can judge people on the basis of some of these things. Is because I'm not saying they have to physically be beautiful, but their lives should indicate some kind of adherence and some kind of devotion to truth and beauty and goodness and justice. Okay? Because if they are not capable of that, I already know what kind of character that they have. It's a poor one.